Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the first afternoon session, and I think it was very apt that Boris closed his session by describing how Churchill sometimes called this country the little English donkey, and sometimes at other times the British lion, that we move on to discussing Churchill in the animal kingdom. But our speaker, Dr. Piers Brendon, is a distinguished author, writer of many books, including works on the British Empire and also, of course, on Churchill. He graduated from Cambridge, a fellow of Cambridge, but was also the custodian of that wonderful resource, the Churchill Archive Centre, the font of all knowledge. So material aplenty should be available. So I would love Piers to come to the floor and discuss Churchill with animals, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Well, I've only got 3/4 of an hour, so it's going to be a bit of a gallop, I'm afraid. Those of you who, with young children or grandchildren, will need no introduction to Helen Oxenbury, whose book, We're Going on a Bear Hunt, has sold millions of copies. And Helen's been kind enough to contribute several of the illustrations for this lecture, whose subject is, as the title indicates, Churchill's relationship with the animal kingdom. And this this is no mere entertainment. It is an entertainment, I hope, but it's because Churchill's wit and personality were incomparable. But I think what I shall try to persuade you is that animals were not just a trivial or incidental aspect of Churchill's life, but important for a whole host of reasons. For example, the crucial dichotomy in Churchill's worldview was his belief in the revolutionary potential of science, as best embodied, of course, in Churchill College, Cambridge, with its 30-odd Nobel Prizes, one, of course, his own, and his reverence for the immemorial traditions that made Britain great. Thus, he was quick to see the advantages, as we've heard, of mechanical vehicles of progress, such as automobiles, and he pioneered their adaptation into armored cars and tanks, which he called mechanical elephants. He took a keen interest in the fascinating new art of flying, as we've heard, and he was probably the first politician to pilot a plane, and he formed the Royal Naval Air Service. So that's one aspect of Churchill's life. However, he treated cars as well as aircraft and even warships as cavalry chargers. When driving himself, he tried to accelerate with the brake on. He used the pavement to overtake slow coaches, and he had several brushes with the law. Yet while reveling in automotive speed, he had a lifelong passion for horses. He was an inveterate equestrian, riding not only like the cavalryman, but like the steeplechaser, the pig sticker, the fox hunter, and the polo player that he also was. In fact, he went so far as to deplore the replacement of the noble quadruped by the internal combustion engine. That's his joke. He also expressed regret that man had parted company with his trusty friend the horse and had sailed into the azure with the eagles. So here's the first key thing to the paradox that I'm trying to explore about Churchill, namely that his faith in a technological future was always tempered by his nostalgia for a chivalric past. Given his illustrious ancestry, of course, such nostalgia was understandable. Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace in 1874, grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, and he was about as blue-blooded on his father's side as it was possible to be. I say nothing about his renegade American side. He set much store by pedigree, needless to say, not just in humans, but in horses and dogs, and even in much humbler creatures. For example, he made a point of ordering exceptionally well-bred maggots from Yorkshire at a cost of 22 shillings and sixpence a week to feed his cherished goldfish and golden orf at Chartwell. These fish themselves, he maintained, are cut above finny plebeians such as vulgar tench or common pike, in every sense coarse fish. Aristocratic maggots, these are, he sometimes said. Look how well the fish are doing on them. Aristocratic maggots, it's a lovely conception. Furthermore, Churchill conformed to the aristocratic convention, also a key paradox, that a gentleman spent much of his time hunting, shooting and fishing, while doting on the horses, hounds and other furred and feathered friends which he surrounded himself with at home. One Duchess of Marlborough, Gladys Spencer Churchill, the second wife of Winston's cousin Sonny, described Blenheim Palace as murderous with heavy people and talk of guns, game, etc. Yet Blenheim was famous for the pedigree cocker spaniels which the dukes had bred, and she herself was so besotted by dogs that she entered every room on a moving carpet of King Charles's spaniels and virtually turned the great house into a kennel. Winston was brought up, in fact, in symbiosis with so-called brute creation. As a small boy, he was a keen bug hunter, adept at netting butterflies, dragonflies, moths, and so on. As a youth, he encouraged by his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, he pursued game with saddle, gun, and rod. He revelled in the excitement of the chase, telling his mother, Jenny, née Jerome, that fox hunting was the greatest pleasure in the world. In India, he became an ardent hog hunter. In Africa, he shot everything from crocodiles to ostriches, including, among other large quadrupeds, 3 rare white rhinoceroses. In Normandy, he chased wild boar. At Balmoral, he once dispatched 3 stags in a single day. And throughout his career, he enjoyed the sporting amenities of Scotland, shooting grouse, pheasant, snipe, and partridge, and catching trout and salmon. In England, he rode to hounds well into old age. Yet from his infancy upwards, he was devoted to animals. He kept guinea pigs and tame bunnies while slaying wild rabbits. He had an affinity with felines, signing himself in letters home as a schoolboy, the pussycat. At prep school, he was smitten by a dear little fox terrier puppy, and at Harrow, he sold his bicycle to buy a bulldog, the purpose of which escaped his fond nanny, Mrs. Everest, unless it is to keep us all in terror of our lives, she said in that letter. Subsequently, at Chartwell Manor, his pocket Blenheim in Kent, Churchill accumulated an extensive menagerie. He lavished care, cash, and emotion on the well-being of its inmates, who became part of his extended family, and he always referred to them in comically refined terms. Dogs did not make messes on the carpet, they committed indiscretions. Cows did not breed, they attended to their family affairs. Fish were not pregnant, but in an interesting condition. Dwelling amid fauna and flora, he said, was the ideal form of existence. He went further, once remarking, the world would be better off if it were inhabited only by animals. Bob Boothby, his sometime PPS, exaggerated when he said that Churchill had little regard for human life, least of all for his own, but that he would cry over the death of a swan or a cat. But it is true that Churchill was moved to tears when contemplating the wholesale slaughter caused by the area bombing of Germany during the Second World War, for reasons which will become clear. Here's Churchill talking. 10,000s of lives were extinguished in one night, he said. Old men, old women, little children. Yes, yes, children about to be born. And pussycats. The lisping delivery, combined with the pathetic conclusion, provoked nervous mirth among those around the dinner table. And when Churchill detected it, he turned like a flash and said in deadly earnest, "When I mention pussycats, I would not have you think I take them lightly." However, Churchill expected his own felines to face the Blitz bravely, and he was mortified when his black cat Nelson hid under a chest of drawers at number 10 Downing Street during an air raid. "Come out, Nelson," he commanded. "Shame on you, bearing a name such as yours, to skulk there while the enemy is overhead." Blackie, here he is, was evidently a truer embodiment of the traditions of the senior service. In none of this was Churchill unique. English aristocrats and others had no difficulty in reconciling their traditional addiction to blood sports with a fondness for animals. Their sympathy for their pets was deepened both by the development of humane feelings culminating in the Romantic movement, which recognized the innocence, freedom, beauty, and vitality of such as the skylark, nightingale, albatross, field mouse, and even fly, and by Darwin's theory of evolution, which demonstrated the kinship of all creatures great and small. Churchill himself believed that kindness to animals was the mark and the duty of civilization. This line he pursued in his private and his public life. Such was his empathy for the livestock farmed at Chartwell that he opposed the slaying of any creature to whom he had said good morning. And on one memorable occasion, he asked his wife Clementine to carve the goose because it was a friend of mine. As Minister of War in 1919, he intervened angrily to bring home tens of thousands of horses that had served the British Army on the Western Front and were still languishing in France at risk of hunger, disease, and death. Churchill engaged with animals on a personal level. Of course, many people talked to their pets and to other creatures, endowing them with language in a vain endeavour to bridge the gulf that lies between the species. But Churchill was the complete anthropomorphist. More than most, he invested animals with human characteristics and communicated with them as individuals. Thus, he offered his thoroughbred colt, Colonist II, an enticing reward for victory, which apparently explained why he came forth. I told him that this was a very big race, and if he won, he would never have to run again, but spend the rest of his life in agreeable female company. Colonist II did not keep his mind on the race, he said. Churchill wrote letters to and from his poodle Rufus, an animal it was hard for others to like because of his appalling halitosis. One private secretary said that Rufus had breath like a flamethrower. But Churchill doted on him and made elaborate endeavours to arrange his marital affairs. It's an amazing letter, really, if you have time to read it. He sat Rufus on his lap during films. And once, when they were watching the scene in Oliver Twist, in which Bill Sikes prepares to drown his dog to put the police off his track, Churchill covered Rufus's eyes with his hand, saying, "Don't look now, dear, I'll tell you about it afterwards." Churchill held telepathic converse with his sheep Friendly. Once during the 1930s, sitting at Chartwell with port and cigar, he felt a strong urge to feed Friendly, but realized that the sheep was too far away. And then he told his wife Clementine that he looked out, he saw Friendly marching down the hill. Friendly trotted, cantered, and Churchill said it was the most amazing case of thought transference, and this most intelligent animal realized my intention of giving it bread, and out he went, and he fed Friendly. So he had a sort of telepathy, he thought, with Friendly the sheep. Churchill communed most often with his cats. On the 3rd of June 1941, for example, when he was worried by military setbacks, he had lunch at Chartwell with his private secretary, Jock Colville, to whom he said almost nothing, and with his marmalade cat, Tango, who sat on a chair to his right and occupied most of his attention. Colville recorded that he kept up a running conversation with the cat, cleaning its eyes with a napkin, offering it mutton, and expressing regret that it could not have cream in wartime. He wrote notes to Dear Nelson, thanking him for sending him a card from his birthday. So these are animals, with the help of secretaries, of course, kept up a sort of running correspondence with Churchill. Churchill sometimes thought that Nelson was too communicative, once accusing him of semaphoring state secrets with his tail to the pelicans in St. James's Park. Churchill's fondness for cats was well known. Most famously, he was given Jock by his secretary, Jock Colville, and was deluged with other feline gifts, nearly all of which he refused. Once his secretary brought him a basket of white kittens with red bows, presented by a Chartwell neighbour. They at once made themselves at home, chasing round the room, burrowing under the bedclothes and tearing up his papers. After an hour, Churchill could bear it no more. "Take these kittens away," he thundered, "before I fall in love with them." Churchill also had an adoring relationship with his azure blue and emerald green budgerigar, Toby, whom he acquired in 1954. Toby pecked at Churchill's cigars, strutted across the dining room table, fought with his reflection in the silver pepper pot, and chattered like a schoolgirl at a picnic. Moreover, Toby literally made his mark on visitors, in the course of one call making no fewer than 14 messes on the bald pate of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, R.A. Butler. The Chancellor was amused, though Churchill called him old cock, while he called Toby darling. Wiping his pate with a white silk handkerchief, Butler sighed, "The things I do for England." Toby acquired a taste for alcohol such a taste for alcohol that he once fell into his master's brandy glass. This did nothing to diminish Churchill's affection for him, and he determined to purchase a similar bird for Field Marshal Montgomery. But in deference to Monty's strict standards of temperance, he stipulated that his budgie should be a teetotaler. In August 1942, when Churchill first visited the Kremlin, he attempted to convey his enthusiasm for goldfish to Stalin. It was a piquant episode which perfectly illustrates the gulf between the soft-hearted Western democrat and the bloodthirsty Oriental despot. Churchill told Stalin that he was very fond of goldfish, and the Soviet leader hospitably invited him to have some for breakfast. In the 1950s, Churchill became even more infatuated, if possible, with tropical fish, filling Chartwell and Chequers with large tanks full of slivers of quicksilver, a living kaleidoscope, a glittering piece of kinetic art. As if mesmerized, Churchill would neglect his work and gaze at them for 20 minutes at a time, calling them by name, extolling their beauty, admiring their colors, exclaiming on their antics, and dilating on their love life, all the while puffing away at a cigar. Once he was overheard addressing one of the guppies, who are tropical minnows, in these terms: "Darling, I do love you. I would make love to you if only I knew how." Churchill doted almost as much on goats. He went to considerable trouble to ensure that the Welsh Fusiliers formed the Guard of Honour at his summit meeting with President Eisenhower and the French Premier Joseph Laniel in Bermuda in 1953, because their regimental mascot was a beautiful white goat called Billy, with whom I had made friends in Jamaica, he said. Actually, the goat nearly caused a diplomatic incident in Bermuda. Churchill lavished much more attention on it while greeting Laniel at the airport than he did on the French Premier himself. He even had Billy ceremonially paraded round the dinner table at Government House. Ike was much amused by Churchill's devotion to this goat, but Laniel was not. In fact, Churchill had Catholic tastes in animals. He was keen on parrots, despite the fact that his own sometimes bit him, provoking bellows of unparliamentary language. Along with other wildfowl, ducks were honoured guests at Chartwell. When he received some coombe duck from India in 1934, Churchill said that he hoped by firm government to make them loyal subjects. One of Churchill's favourite pieces of verse was a skit about the ducks in St. James's Park, which appeared in Punch in 1895. I don't know whether you can read that. It purported to be a soliloquy by a socialistic loafer, there he is lying on the ground in St. James's Park, who complained in exaggerated Cockney that he could get no rest in the park because of the noise of the ducks, which were bursting with free cakes and buns. Churchill often recited the poem, not least in a secret test before the television cameras when preparing to announce his retirement as Prime Minister in 1955. So that's 60 years on, he could still remember the poem. But he disliked both the medium of television and the result, and the film was never shown. Churchill treasured his cows, and on arriving in Normandy after the successful D-Day landings, he coined a richly bucolic image to express his joy. "We are surrounded by fat cattle lying in luscious pastures with their paws crossed," he said. When playing golf, he once removed a worm from the fairway, saying, "Poor fellow, if I leave you here, you will be trampled by some ruthless boot." When a ladybird landed on his nightclothes in 1949, he asked General Pownall to remove this exquisite and charming creature from my sleeve. and allow it carefully to fly out of the window. Churchill's curiosity about exotic creatures was insatiable, and when in 1953 he heard from a dubious source about a remarkable lobster-like creature called a sea cricket to be found in San Remo, he set off in pursuit of this creature and searched San Remo high and low, but to Churchill's chagrin, this search produced nothing better than one disappointingly ugly crustacean. Churchill delighted in circuses, carnivals, fairs, and zoos, enjoying especially the frolics of wrestling bears and acrobatic sea lions. He was particularly devoted to London Zoo and correspondingly perturbed about its plans to kill dangerous animals at the beginning of the war. He presented the zoo's secretary, Julian Huxley, with a wonderfully apocalyptic... he protested to the zoo's secretary in wonderfully apocalyptic terms. What a pity. Imagine a great air raid on this great city of ours. Squadrons of enemy planes dropping their bombs on London, houses smashed to bits, fires breaking out everywhere, corpses lying in the smoking ashes, and lions and tigers roaming the desolation in search of corpses. And you're going to shoot them. What a pity. Strangely enough, this horrific vision became a reality when the Luftwaffe bombed Belgrade in April 1941, about which Churchill wrote, surely not without a degree of relish, "Out of the nightmare of smoke and fire came the maddened animals released from their shattered cages in the zoological gardens." So he liked the sort of drama of animals. A number of Churchill's animals were housed in Regent's Park at different times, notably big beasts that were presented to him. In 1943, he was given a lion called Rota, and he sent this letter to the Duke of Devonshire, who served on the zoo's council. "I shall have much pleasure in becoming the possessor of the lion, on condition that I do not have to feed it or take care of it, and that the zoo makes sure it does not get loose. You are quite right in your assumption that I do not want a lion at the moment, either at Downing Street or Chequers, owing to the ministerial calm which prevails there. But the zoo is not far away, and situations may arise when I shall have great need of it." He liked visiting and feeding Rota, and once threatened to make a diminutive secretary the lion's next meal, saying, "Meat is very short now." Unfortunately, the lion took Churchill for a ride. It was called Rota after a German printing machine company of that name, whose pre-war sales manager in England, a man named George Thompson, had given it to Churchill with the proviso that he would have the skin of the lion when it died, which it did after siring many cubs in 1955. Thompson then had the lion stuffed and exhibited in a Piccadilly showroom, though Churchill prevented him from using his most famous leonine quotation delivered in a speech on his 80th birthday. You'll all know it probably by heart. "It was the nation and the race dwelling all round the globe that had the lion's heart. I had the luck to be called upon to give the roar." The zoo also accommodated Churchill's leopard Sheba, some of his black swans and tropical fish, and 2 white kangaroos, a token of esteem from South Australia. These he received in 1947, saying that he didn't mind if the publicity and the photographers could snap him as much as they pleased. "In the kangaroo's pouch, if they like, with my legs all sprawling about." Wonderful image of Churchill in the kangaroo's pouch. Furthermore, the zoo assisted with other animal transactions, whereby Churchill cemented his friendship with President Roosevelt via a gift of Chartwell goldfish, and improved relations with China by sanctioning the swap of rare pair David deer for 2 Chinese alligators. Thus, Churchill imitated the practice of the ancients and anticipated modern panda diplomacy. His most ambitious endeavour in this respect also concerned Australia. After the loss of Singapore, Churchill was anxious to mend his fences with John Curtin's Labour government in Canberra. So he requested a symbol of Anglo-American accord in the shape of, he wanted 6 duck-billed platypuses, but he only got 1. This duck-billed platypus came across the Pacific on a ship. It was housed in a special platypussery, and it was equipped with 50,000 selected worms. And it ate 750 of them a day. The voyage took rather a long time, and by the time they got to the Panama Canal, its daily diet was cut to 600 worms because they were running out, and the ship's master had to employ locals to dig up a further 8,000 worms for the platypus. But the platypus didn't like Panamanian worms, So it was in a reduced condition when, near the end of its Atlantic crossing, the ship was attacked by a German submarine and retaliated with depth charges. Alas, the explosions further upset the creature's delicate mechanism. Its duck-bill had electrosensory organs for hunting, and it died. And Churchill was most upset about this, and he kept the failure of this operation a secret, though he made the best of it by having the animal stuffed and presented to the Royal College of Surgeons. Churchill relished animal stories, especially those of Kipling, and confessed to roaming the jungles with Mowgli and fighting for dear life in the skin of the mongoose Rikki-Tikki-Tavi against the cobra nag. He liked to recite Kipling in his bath, twiddling the taps with his toes. Animals occupied a key place in his imagination. He identified with them, and they supplied his family with terms of endearment. Churchill was Pug, or Pig, to Clementine's cat. Returning home, he would utter a sharp woof woof, answered by her enthusiastic meow. And they often ended letters to each other with sketches of their four-footed avatars. Their offspring, that's quite a good Clemmy cat, but his Pug was very peculiar. The kittens, the children, had all individual animal nicknames. The puppy kitten was Diana, the rabbit Randolph, the bumblebee Sarah, the mule, because she was stubborn and wouldn't breed, Sarah, and the duckadilly was Marigold, the one who died, and the last one, Mary, was called the chimp. Unlike many patricians who notoriously preferred their horses and dogs to their children, Churchill was an affectionate parent. He played animal games with his brood, chasing them in the guise of a bear or a gorilla. The latter he imitated with uncanny accuracy, crouching behind bushes and jumping out with his arms swinging limply, baring his teeth, beating his chest, and emitting a blood-curdling roar of grr, grr. Perhaps his interpretation was enhanced by the fact that, in the opinion of David Lloyd George at least, Churchill physically resembled a gorilla. During the course of his career, needless to say, he was compared to a whole variety of other creatures, among them lion, warhorse, chicken, rat, maggot, mongrel, porpoise, dinosaur, bulldog, inebriated dragon, wild boar, rogue elephant, you name it. Indeed, Churchill seemed to compel animal analogies. In a single dispatch to the Foreign Office, Britain's somewhat louche ambassador to the Soviet Union, Archie Clark Kerr, likened Churchill, visiting Moscow in 1942, to a bull about to charge, its eyes bloodshot and defiant, to a wounded lion, to a protean creature able to transform its features from the most laughing, dimpled, and mischievous baby's bottom into the face of an angry and outraged bullfrog, and to, and this is on this particular page, a dog with two cocks. I suppose that's a rather coarse equivalent of a dog with two tails. And it's rather odd, isn't it, when I guess that probably is the only picture of Churchill in his birthday suit available. I was glad. If anybody's seen it, speak now. I could dilate on the question of circumcision, but I won't. Churchill himself pullulated with animal analogies. His head was a virtual Noah's Ark, bursting with figures of speech. In fact, animal imagery loomed almost as large in his rhetoric as the military metaphors for which, as a soldier, he instinctively reached. He famously said that in wartime, truth is so precious that she should be attended by a bodyguard of lies. But he used an even more graphic expression to assert that secrecy was not enough and that stratagems must be adopted by which Britain's enemies were positively deceived and confused. And here's the phrase that he used: not the silence of the oyster serene in its grotto, but the smudge and blur of the cuttlefish. A wonderful phrase, and again, the animal imagery comes. Churchill exploited sheep, pigs, and other creatures as a source of personal amusement or oratorical entertainment, by which he brilliantly disarmed opposition in the Commons. He told Labour MPs, "I do not wish to cast my pearls before those who do not want them." Sometimes he was less disarming. He described the Labour MP, Clement Attlee, as a sheep in sheep's clothing. And when Attlee's cabinet colleagues misbehaved in his absence, Churchill said, "When the mouse is away, the cats will play." Churchill ransacked the wilderness for bestial analogies with which to stigmatize his fiercest foes. He rejected a rapprochement with Nazi Germany by recalling the fable of the jackal who went hunting with the tiger and what happened when the hunt was over. He also branded Mussolini a jackal, and still more obnoxious a hyena. One of his most memorable taunts was directed against those French generals who had prophesied in 1940 that within 3 weeks England would have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken, some neck. The boa constrictor was a favoured figure in his repertoire of invective. Soon after Hitler seized Austria in March 1938, Churchill employed it, as Punch did later, combining the sinister and comic features of Nazi Germany's engorgement of its neighbour in his inimitable fashion. 2 months ago, I reminded the House of Commons that after a boa constrictor had devoured a goat or a deer, it usually slept the sleep of the repletion for several months. It may, however, happen that this agreeable process is disturbed by indigestion. If the prey has not been sufficiently crushed or covered with slime beforehand, especially if it has been swallowed, horns and all, very violent spasms, accompanied by writhings and contortions, reachings and gaspings, are suffered by the great snake. These purely zoological observations, of which further details can be found in Buffon's Natural History, suggest a parallel, no doubt very remote, to what happened since Austria was incorporated in the German Reich. It's a wonderful put-down of Hitler, comparing him to a boa constrictor. The Soviet Union further tested, though it by no means exhausted, his feral lexicon. He represented the Bolsheviks as snakes, wolves, vultures, crocodiles, bears, vampires, typhus-bearing vermin, the tapeworm inside the Russian dog, the nameless beast foretold in Muscovite legend, and above all, of course, as baboons, hopping and capering amidst the ruins of civilization and the corpses of their victims. When a Soviet trade delegation led by Leonid Krasin visited London in 1920, Churchill asked the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, "Did you shake hands with the hairy baboon?" In using animals as emblems of virtue and vice, Churchill was drawing on a tradition that stretched from Aesop to Orwell, who of course depicted the communist leaders as pigs. And Churchill himself had a gift for fashioning fables. He adored butterflies and explained to his young nephew Johnny that caterpillars were greedy and lazy were punished in their next world by becoming drab meadow browns or common heaths and living short, miserable lives, whereas a good caterpillar would become a gorgeous swallowtail or a painted lady or even a Camberwell beauty and may be allowed to hibernate for the winter and enjoy the spring the following year. Zoologically unsound, it was, as a juvenile reincarnation myth, morally persuasive. Still more compelling was Churchill's wonderful speech to the Commons in 1928, designed to expose the folly of interwar disarmament. I'm going to gabble this away because it's such a wonderful encapsulation of Churchill's rhetoric and his capacity for using animals in a creative kind of way. Baldwin was terribly jealous that he hadn't thought it up himself. I won't try and imitate Churchill. Once upon a time, all the animals in the zoo decided they would disarm, and they arranged to have a conference to arrange the matter. So the rhinoceros said, when he opened the proceedings, that the use of teeth was barbarous and horrible and ought to be strictly prohibited by general consent. Horns, which were mainly defensive weapons, would of course have to be allowed. The buffalo, the stag, the porcupine, and even the little hedgehog all said that they would vote with the rhino, but the lion and the tiger took a different view. They defended teeth and even claws, which they described as honourable weapons of immemorial antiquity. The panther, the leopard, the puma, and the whole tribe of small cats all supported the lion and the tiger. Then the bear spoke. He proposed that both teeth and horns should be banned and never used again for fighting by any animal. It would be enough if animals were allowed to give each other a good hug when they quarrelled. No one could object to that. It was so fraternal, and that would be a great step towards peace. However, all the other animals were very offended with the bear, and the turkey fell into a perfect panic. The discussion got so hot and angry And all those animals began thinking so much about horns and teeth and hugging when they argued about their peaceful intentions that had brought them together, that they began to look at one another in a very nasty way. Luckily, the keepers were able to calm them down and persuade them to go back quietly to their cages, and they began to feel quite friendly with one another again. A few weeks after Hitler came to power, Churchill, still in fabulous vein, entertainingly updated the legend of St. George and the Dragon, his target being national decadence, Britain's reliance on a vague internationalism instead of its own imperial might. And here he's talking to the Commons. The modern St. George would arrive at Cappadocia, accompanied not by a horse, but by a secretariat. He would be armed not with a lance, but with several flexible formulae. He would, of course, be welcomed by the local branch of the League of Nations Union. He would propose a conference with the Dragon, a round-table conference, no doubt, that would be more convenient for the Dragon's tail. He would make a trade agreement with the Dragon. He would lend the Dragon a lot of money for the Cappadocian taxpayers. The maiden's release would be referred to Geneva, the Dragon reserving all his rights meanwhile. Finally, St. George would be photographed with the Dragon. Such symbolism had a universal appeal. Animals are among the earliest denizens of a child's mind, and they help to shape the adult consciousness. They're integral to the culture of Homo sapiens. They have been objects of veneration and detestation, victims of cruelty and sacrifice, subjects of art, literature, and myth, participants in war, work, and peace, at once a source of danger and a wellspring of health and happiness. They are slaughtered for food, but alive they nourish the human imagination. They are alluring but mysterious, made of our common clay but without the power of speech. They are often comical but seem to lack the faculty of laughter. Although eating, sleeping, fighting, and procreating like us, they are unfathomably alien. Thus they became a screen onto which human beings down the ages projected their own attributes: meek lamb, cunning fox, savage bull, lecherous goat, busy bee, and so on. Churchill's associations with animals was, as I've suggested, often paradoxical. He doted on faithful dogs, but damned miserable curs, and feared the black dog of depression that constantly prowled at his heels and sometimes jumped on his back. He hunted foxes, but kept fox cubs at Churchill as pets, along with the children's rabbits. Peregrine tells a story about how, to his horror, his pet rabbit turned up on the dining room table at Churchill, and Churchill ate it. He speared hogs, but he scratched the backs of pigs. And, of course, he depicted himself as a pig. He loved fishing, but he also loved fish. Churchill was likened to Pooh Bear, but he warned that Red Bruin was padding across the steppes towards Europe on blood-stained paws. Later he added this thought: a bear in the forest is a matter of legitimate speculation. A bear in the zoo is an object of public curiosity. A bear in your wife's bed causes the gravest concern. Wherever you look in his career, his speeches, his writing, you find the creatures that have shared the earth with mankind throughout history. Churchill's life is, in key respects, an animal story. Thank you very much.